This is a seminar that I recently delivered to faculty and students in the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town. It revisits Hannah Arendt's concept of the masses in order to make sense of a paradox that appears to have traveled through time in modern human society and re-emerged today. It's based on an academic essay that I've written with my wife, Vanya Gastro. She is an expert on Hannah Arendt, who has heavily influenced my own work over the years that we've been together. I'll begin with this quote from Karl Jaspers, written in the preface to Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. He says, "Never has our future been more unpredictable. Never have we depended so much on political forces that cannot be trusted to follow the rules of common sense and self-interest, forces that look like sheer insanity if judged by the standards of other centuries. It is as though mankind had divided itself between those who believe in human omnipotence, who think that everything is possible if one knows how to organize masses for it, and those for whom powerlessness has become the major experience of their lives." Jaspers describes a world divided between two experiences. On the one hand, the belief that everything is possible through the organization of the masses, and on the other, a deep and pervasive experience of powerlessness. I want to suggest that this tension has not disappeared. In fact, it may define our present moment. We, paradoxically, live in a world of unprecedented participation, visibility, and connection, and yet, at the same time, there's a widespread sense that we are unable to act together in ways that meaningfully shape political life. So the starting point is quite simple. How can we have more participation than ever before, more voices, more expression, more visibility, and yet experience less collective political power? Most contemporary explanations isolate particular causes. They point to populism, or digital media, or economic precarity, and all of these are important. But what I want to suggest is that they don't go far enough. To understand what is happening, we need to situate the present within a longer historical trajectory, one that tracks the historical emergence of what Hannah Arendt referred to as the masses. And she referred to this phenomenon in very specific terms. Before doing that, however, it's worth briefly discussing how this term is used very differently across political traditions. On the left, the masses are often understood as the people, a collective political subject typically rooted in class, engaged in class struggle against economic and political elites. On the right, the masses are imagined quite differently, as ordinary people, bearers of moral values, tradition, and national identity, often positioned against liberal or cosmopolitan elites. Despite their differences, both of these views share something important. They treat the masses as a coherent political subject, capable of agency, representation, and collective action. Let's now turn to Arendt's definition of the masses, because it differs substantially from left-wing and right-wing conceptions of what and who the masses are. For Arendt, the masses are not a political subject at all. They are not defined by class or poverty or ideology, but by disconnection. They cut across classes from the lowest to the highest, and are largely disconnected from politics. The masses are individuals who are socially atomized, politically unrepresented and inactive, and unable to act in concert with others, that is, collectively to assert power. In her conception, the masses are not the people. They are what remains when the structures that make political life possible begin to disintegrate. Arendt is very precise about the conditions that produce this. The masses comprise uprooted individuals, who are cut loose from traditional structures of belonging, class, party, association, or community, who experience politics not as a field of action, but as something imposed from above. Uprootedness and superfluousness, which she tracks back to industrialization, undergirds the other distinctions. The other distinctions are specific to her conception of the masses. Isolation is political. It refers to the loss of the capacity to act with others. Atomization is social, the breakdown of relationships and shared structures. And loneliness is the lived experience of both. I will discuss uprootedness more as we go along, because she uses the term across a range of different historical contexts. Safe to say that it is under conditions of isolation, atomization, and loneliness that Arendt's masses emerge. To understand how this happens, Arendt traces a long historical trajectory. Mass society does not appear suddenly. It's produced over time. And I'll move through this quite quickly. The first key moment is the collapse of feudalism and the advent of industrial capitalism. It produces uprootedness from stable feudal structures. These structures did not just organize economic life, they provided forms of belonging and orientation within political life. The collapse of feudal hierarchies breaks down inherited forms of belonging. People are no longer tied to land, guild, or estate. They become formally equal, but they are socially and politically unmoored. Labor becomes abstracted from tradition. Individuals become interchangeable. They are integrated into economic life, but not necessarily into political community. As industrial capitalism rises and matures, land, tradition, and corporate identity, that is, guild or belonging under a coat of arms, are lost, along with stable and social and political frameworks. Power concentrates with capital, rendering them subject to a politics imposed from above. Industrialism's workers are uprooted from association, community, and belonging. The second moment is imperialism, particularly its later stages, such as the Victorian era. Here, Arendt introduces the figure of the superfluous man, individuals who have been displaced from meaningful roles in European society. These individuals are not the heroic adventurers of old, but people who have been, as she puts it, spat out of European society. What is important here is not that they become the masses, they don't, but they embody certain psychological and political conditions, uprootedness, estrangement, susceptibility to fascination and charismatic leadership that will later become generalized under very different structural conditions, that is, in Central and Eastern Europe. At the same time, imperialism develops new forms of rule. These forms are detached from law and citizenship, justified by race thinking and enforced by bureaucracy. So what emerges in the colonies are new forms of rule, organized not through law and citizenship, but through race thinking and bureaucratic administration. Power becomes detached from the frameworks that would ordinarily limit it. So imperialism does not produce mass society directly. It produces the conditions and techniques that will later be redeployed within Europe itself. The decisive transformation happens in interwar Europe, which is characterized by intense economic shocks, social upheaval, and political instability. The collapse of empires, the proliferation of stateless populations, economic dislocation, and fragile political institutions produce societies in which large segments of the population are uprooted and no longer meaningfully represented. At the same time, class solidarities and civic associations weakened. institutions that once mediated political life begin to erode. It is under these conditions in Central and Eastern Europe that mass society fully emerges, specifically when the masses become uprooted from class, party, association, and community. So we need to keep a clear distinction here. It is important to understand that Arendt is not saying that the subjects of the later stages of imperialism became the masses, but rather that imperialism provides the conditions and techniques, new forms of rule that operate beyond the law and citizenship, governed by race-based thinking and bureaucratic domination, that produce totalitarianism in Central and Eastern Europe. While interwar Europe provides the mass condition itself, volatility and uncertainty produced uprootedness, atomization, isolation, and loneliness. This is where uprooted individuals become politically mobilizable as masses. Totalitarianism rise up in both Nazi Germany with the rise of fascism and in the Soviet Union with the rise of communism. Both were expansionist pan movements, mobilizing pan-Germanic and pan-Slavic identities across national borders. This is a key distinguishing factor for totalitarian movements in Arendt's conception of them, that they are pan movements, not restricted to a single country. And critically, the Second World War then ensued, wreaking great devastation and destruction in a short period of time, after which a wholly new era ensued. After the Second World War, these dynamics are partially stabilized through the establishment of labor society, by which I mean societies where labor is the organizing unit and/or principle of society. It stabilizes society because labor integrates individuals through work and institutions. Belonging is tied to employment, class organization, and welfare structures. Political life is mediated through parties, unions, and civic associations. The result was the distinctive politics of the post-war 20th century: mass democracy without mass isolation, conflict without disintegration, and inequality mediated through institutional compromise. Yet this integration came at a cost. Political life was increasingly subordinated to economic function, and citizenship itself became conditional upon productive participation. Labor was politicized, but this simultaneously narrowed politics to the sphere of work. Those who fell outside stable employment, whether through exclusion, dependency, or structural changes, were once again uprooted. Labor society thus mitigated the condition of mass isolation only contingently, stabilizing belonging through work while leaving intact the deeper dynamics that would later reassert themselves. This fragile compact began to erode in the late 20th century as the centrality of labor to social integration gave way to a new organizing principle for society: consumption. Labor society begins to transform with the rise of consumer society. Belonging is no longer anchored primarily in work, but in consumption. Status becomes increasingly performative. Identity becomes something that is expressed through lifestyle and choice. If labor society organized belonging and status around productive participation, consumer society reorganized them around consumption. In the place of political representation grounded in work and vocation, consumer society offers status through choice, lifestyle, and access to goods and services, all enabled by debt finance consumption and hyper-financialization of the global economy. This shift appears to resolve the crisis of labor society by broadening political bases through decoupling belonging from employment. Instead, it promotes or promises inclusion through abundant consumption, a promise that coheres with liberal individualism's image of the sovereign choosing individual. Yet consumption, unlike labor, is structurally insatiable. It demands continual participation. It produces no stable identity and erodes the social bonds that once anchored belonging. Society becomes more about status signaling, that is, like keeping up with the Joneses or conspicuous consumption, rather than fostering relational social belonging. Status is no longer something one possesses by virtue of contribution, but something that must be endlessly performed and signaled in order to have meaning. Because such status inherently lacks stability, its pursuit generates fragility rather than security. Under conditions of formal freedom and proliferating choice, individuals appear increasingly autonomous while becoming ever more interchangeable. Inclusion in consumer society is secured not through economic function, political agency, or stable social roles, but through participation in competitive markets that abstract people into units of demand. Political power recedes as freedom is redefined as private choice, leaving individuals formally free, yet increasingly powerless to enter public spheres to shape the conditions of collective existence. Isolation thus re-emerges in the late 20th century and early 21st century beneath the surface of inclusion, not as overt exclusion, but as a condition in which individuals remain formally integrated as consumers while becoming increasingly replaceable and politically inconsequential. Rather than being eliminated, this condition is managed and deferred through participation in markets that stabilize insecurity without resolving it. Consumer society absorbs discontent by translating shared structural vulnerability into private competition, encouraging individuals to interpret economic precarity and social instability as matters of personal responsibility rather than collective political concern. When this mechanism falters, when choice can no longer compensate for instability, the organized loneliness of the atomized masses returns to the fore, stripped of solidaristic bonds, yet saturated with grievance. In this last part of the seminar, I will turn our attention to the rise of digital consumer society and its implication for Arendt's conception of the masses. The rise of the digital society plays a key role in these developments. The late 20th and early 21st century brought the digital revolution. This does not eclipse consumer society, but intensifies and reorganizes it under digital and algorithmic conditions. What had previously been mediated through markets, advertising, and mass media is now organized through online platforms that continuously sort, rank, and render individuals visible to one another. Consumption did not recede in this transformation. Rather, it became increasingly immaterial, symbolic, and performative. Goods and services remained central, but were now embedded in digital infrastructures that reward attention, visibility, and engagement. Consumption becomes an ongoing process of self-presentation. In this algorithmic extension of consumer society, status is no longer merely displayed through possession of goods, but continuously reproduced through visibility, by broadcasting to large digital audiences. Digital platforms collapse the distinction between private consumption and public appearance, transforming everyday preferences, affiliations, and expressions, many of them trivial, into legible signals that can be quantified, circulated, and evaluated. What matters is not simply what one consumes, but how consumption is curated, narrated, and performed before a virtual audience. Status becomes inseparable from exposure, which in turn is algorithmically mediated. In simple terms, whether a product, meal, cocktail, or service is being consumed by a person, it is now routinely captured and posted on online platforms in service of maintaining individual social status and identity. The digital transformation deepened the dynamics already latent in consumer society. If consumption had been insatiable in the neoliberal era, algorithmic mediation in the 21st century renders it incessant by fusing it with performance. The demand to perform does not arise episodically, but continuously, as always-on platforms reward frequency, intensity, interaction, and conformity to prevailing norms of engagement. Identity itself becomes provisional, sustained only through repeated acts of signaling. Under such conditions, belonging is no longer secured through stable social roles or political participation, but through ongoing alignment with recognizable styles, positions, affects, and even outrages. Visibility becomes a prerequisite for recognition, yet visibility itself is radically unequal. It is distributed through opaque platforms, underpinned by hidden, centralized algorithms that privilege some people and forms of expression while rendering others irrelevant or invisible. So digital and algorithmic systems intensify this transformation. They reorganize participation around visibility. To belong is to be seen, to be recognized, to perform identity in ways that are legible to others and to online platforms. This brings me to the core argument. Mass society today is not reproduced despite participation and belonging, but through them, through visibility, through status performance, through the consumption of causes. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a little more detail later. The result is a paradoxical intensification of both connection and isolation. Digital networks multiply affiliations while thinning them, producing forms of belonging that are immediate yet unstable, that are expansive yet intolerant of disagreement. As politics is increasingly experienced through identity and affect rather than engagement and action, disagreement hardens into moral opposition, and plurality gives way to polarization. Individuals are highly visible, highly connected, constantly engaged, and yet increasingly unable to act together in ways that generate collective power. Arendt helps us understand why. For her, political action is fundamentally different from behavior. Action is unpredictable in the sense of allowing for spontaneity. It is plural in the sense of engaging with a plurality of perspectives, and takes place in concert with others, that is, collectively. Behavior, by contrast, is repeatable. It is norm-driven, and it's often conformist. What we see in digital environments is not the expansion of action, but the multiplication of behavior. Moreover, in the digital extension of consumer society, status is no longer secured through the accumulation of goods and services and online broadcasting of lifestyles, but through the performance of moral, political, and cultural commitments. Causes themselves become objects of consumption, valued less for their capacity to organize collective action than for their function as markers of identity and belonging. Algorithmically mediated echo chambers intensify this dynamic by rewarding conformity, punishing dissent, and translating political engagement into metrics of visibility. Under such conditions, belonging is secured through alignment rather than action, and political expression is increasingly shaped by anticipatory conformity to social group norms. Risky encounters with difference are systematically discouraged, not through formal censorship, but through the social costs of dissent. Disagreement threatens recognition, visibility, and continued inclusion within moral communities. The result is not solidarity, but polarization, not collective power, but organized loneliness intensified by constant display. Individuals are continuously visible, yet relationally isolated, connected through performance rather than mutual engagement. Activism itself is distorted into spectacle. This algorithmic extension of consumer society replaces political action with social behavior that is orientated towards the performative display of identity, seeking engagement primarily as a means of reinforcing alignment and belonging rather than initiating collective action. Consuming causes is not genuine political action. It is behaving socially according to recognizable scripts that privilege in-group belonging over political plurality. A new mass society emerges, pursuing certainty, meaning, and belonging through consumption and display on their social media feeds. Causes themselves become objects of consumption. They signal identity. They provide belonging. But they do not necessarily produce collective action. Participation becomes expressive rather than transformative. What I want to suggest is that participation in digital consumer society is not without cost. In fact, it involves a series of trade-offs that, when taken together, reproduce some of the conditions Arendt associates with mass society. First, status becomes tied to visibility. To belong is to be seen, recognized, and affirmed within digitally mediated environments. But because visibility must be continuously maintained, individuals become dependent on systems that they do not control. Their pursuit of recognition becomes a form of submission to platform logics. Second, participation requires the constant surrender of personal information and data. This is not incidental. It is the price of belonging. In making themselves visible and legible, individuals also render themselves predictable and ultimately manipulable. Third, belonging becomes conditional on alignment. Algorithmically mediated communities tend to reward affirmation and punish deviation. As a result, dissent becomes costly, not necessarily through formal sanctions, but through the withdrawal of recognition or symbolic inclusion. What appears as consensus is often the product of anticipatory conformity. Fourth, under these conditions, independent judgment becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Individuals adapt not through resistance, but through internal adjustment. Behavior begins to substitute for action, and disagreement gives way to the desire for moral alignment. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, these dynamics involve a gradual and often voluntary relinquishment of freedom. In exchange for belonging, recognition, and status, individuals accept surveillance, behavioral regulation, and constraint as conditions of participation. Now, to be clear, this is not totalitarianism, but what it does suggest is the re-emergence of certain structural tendencies that Arendt identifies as the preconditions for totalitarianism: political isolation, social atomization, and the erosion of the capacity to act in concert, conditions that characterize the masses from which the potential for totalitarianism to emerge resides. I will now summarize the consequences of these costs in broader terms. Causes become objects of consumption. They signal identity, they provide belonging, but they do not necessarily produce collective action, and that belonging demands conformity in perspectives and acceptable actions, mitigating against spontaneity and plurality in action. Political participation becomes expressive rather than transformative. Pluralism is indispensable to political life precisely because it allows contradictory positions to be held in view at once. Political judgment depends on the capacity to engage with complexity, to recognize that social and political phenomena may be simultaneously beneficial and harmful, necessary and yet undesirable. When engagement is reduced to single interest positioning, this capacity collapses. Binary alignments displace deliberation, ideological incoherence, paradox, and hypocrisy become increasingly tolerable within one's own moral community, even as they are aggressively identified in opposing groups. The result is a bifurcation of the public world into parallel realities, sustained by echo chambers that reinforce group belonging while narrowing perception and engagement. In-group and out-group divisions intensify, and plurality comes to be experienced not as a condition of political life, but as a threat to identity. As pluralism retreats, so too does the public realm, understood as a space of shared appearance, a space of debate, and a space of action. What remains is a proliferation of social interests and causes, animated by affect and identity, but increasingly detached from political power. The consequences are significant. Plurality gives way to polarization, disagreement becomes difficult to sustain, and the shared world, what Arendt calls common sense, begins to fragment. Karl Jasper's warning, written in the shadow of the 20th century's catastrophes, thus resonates with renewed force in the present. The division he identified between those who believe that everything is possible through the organization of the masses and those for whom powerlessness has become the dominant experience of life has not disappeared, but has been reconfigured. In the digital consumer age, masses are no longer mobilized primarily through ideology imposed from above, but through participation itself. Through digital status seeking, visibility, and superficial sloganeering that accompanies the consumption of cause, power concentrates while action disperses. Expression multiplies while judgment recedes. What appears as unprecedented connectivity coincides with a deepening incapacity to act in concert, to initiate something new, or to sustain a common world. In this sense, the danger Arendt diagnosed has not passed. It has been normalized. The question that remains is not whether mass society has returned, but whether the conditions for political action, plurality, spontaneity, and solidarity can be reclaimed before powerlessness once again becomes the defining experience of the many. Thank you. Hit the like or subscribe button if you want more people to get this on their feeds.